The distress beacon had been transmitting for 11 days before anyone on the Verk Ascendancy's War Council agreed to listen to it. They almost didn't. Distress beacons were common enough in contested space. Debris fields broadcast them for decades after a battle, and the Ascendancy had fought many battles in this system. Automated beacons were logged, cataloged, and quietly deprioritized. The War Council had larger things to consider. There were 3 human colony stations in the outer belt still operating under emergency protocols. There was the matter of the resource survey teams being stonewalled by what remained of human orbital authority. There was the diplomatic deadlock that had been grinding in place for 6 months like a wheel in mud, going nowhere at significant cost. But this signal had a signature, a living signature, royal blood, confirmed twice by independent scanners and once by the prelate's personal physician, who had been summoned from the medical wing at 3 in the morning and had not been sent back. Velkareth, first prelate of the Verk Ascendancy, stood in the center of the command vault aboard the carrier Sovereign Silence and stared at the green planet rotating slowly on the display before him. His face, if you could call it a face, with its layered jawplates and the 4 deep-set eyes arranged in a descending column, was utterly still. He had worn that stillness his entire adult life. It was the face he wore when he sentenced worlds. It was the face he had worn when he accepted the prelacy, and when he led the final assault on the Keth Confederacy's home system, and when he received word that his wife's transport had failed to emerge from the fold point above Keth Prime. He had worn this face to the funerals of people he loved, and to the celebrations of victories he had wanted, and to the long administrative hours of a life spent making decisions that other people would live and die by. He was wearing it now, staring at the green planet, because if he let the stillness go, what was underneath it would be visible to the officers behind him, and that was not something he would allow. "The beacon originates from Grid 47, said his tactical officer Shenvora, whose own coloring had gone pale violet with something she was careful not to name. Northern continent, dense forest cover, elevation approximately 2,000 meters. And the ship? Destroyed on impact, 7 days ago, based on thermal residue. The crash would have been unsurvivable for any crew member who was not. Who was not what I know my son to be, Velkareth said quietly. The vault went silent. He had not said was, he had said is. Everyone present noted it, no one commented. Ground team, he asked. Deployed 12 hours ago. 8 Veth-class hunters. Tracker rated all of them. They have the beacon coordinates and biosignature lock. Estimated acquisition, 24 to 48 hours. Velkareth turned away from the display. The planet disappeared from his field of vision. He did not look at it again for 3 days. Then we wait, he said. His son's name was Rensal, and he was 14 years old, and he was currently folded inside a hollowed-out boulder on a hillside in a forest on a planet called Earth, trying very hard not to breathe. The boulder had been chosen by the woman who had found him. She had not chosen it for him. She had been sheltering in it herself, alone, eating cold beans out of a dented can and listening to the sound of wind in the canopy overhead, waiting with the practiced patience of someone who had made peace with waiting, when he had simply appeared in the entrance. Bleeding from a gash above his secondary eye cluster that had already darkened to the deep blue-black of a serious contusion. Holding his left arm at an angle that was wrong in a way that made her wince before she had consciously processed why. Staring at her with 4 pale amber eyes, arranged in a vertical line that should not have existed on any creature she had encountered in 8 years of wildlife management in these mountains. He was shaking, not from cold, the air was mild, from shock. She had seen enough injured animals to recognize shock in a living thing regardless of what kind of living thing it was. Her name was Carla Munoz. She was 37 years old. She had been a park ranger for this section of wilderness for 8 years before the Verk ships appeared in the upper atmosphere, and the evacuation sirens went off, and the radio filled with voices, she had never heard use that particular frequency of panic, and everything about her professional training became instantly and completely useless except the parts that dealt with surviving in difficult terrain, which turned out to be the most important parts. She had survived 11 days in the mountains by knowing them better than any evacuation route planner or alien tactical officer had any reason to expect. When the alien child appeared in her boulder, she had done 3 things in very quick succession. She had not screamed. She had looked at his arm. She had moved over to make room. "Sit," she said, because it was the most obvious word, and she pointed at the ground beside her, and something about the gesture, or maybe the word, or maybe simply the absence of threat, crossed whatever gap needed crossing, because the boy sat. He folded himself down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain they were trying not to show, and he held his injured arm against his body and watched her with those 4 stacked amber eyes and said nothing. She gave him half her can of beans. She had been rationing carefully. She had 3 more cans in her pack, a bag of trail mix, 6 energy bars, and whatever she could forage, which in this season and this elevation was not nothing, but was not abundant either. Giving him half was not a logical calculation. It was not a diplomatic gesture. It was just what you did when something hurt and hungry sat down across from you. He ate slowly. When he was done, he looked at the can for a long time, as if processing what had just happened, and then he looked at her, and he said something in a language that moved through frequencies she felt more than heard, a sound that seemed to resonate in the spaces behind her back teeth and behind her sternum at the same time. She didn't understand any of it. She understood the tone completely. "You're welcome," she said, and that was how it started. She had learned a few things about him in the first 2 days. He was hurt first and most urgently. The arm, she was nearly certain, was broken, though the anatomy under the skin was difficult to read. The limb was proportioned similarly to a human arm, but the joint locations were slightly different, and when she very carefully pressed along the length of it to assess the break, she found 2 distinct irregularities rather than one, which either meant a more complex fracture or a structural difference she didn't understand. She improvised a splint from straight branches and the spare elastic cords from her pack, which he endured without complaint, though his secondary eye cluster went nearly shut with pain at the tightest point of the binding, and she made a note to herself to check the tension every few hours. The gash on his head she cleaned with the last of her water purification tablets dissolved in stream water, a procedure she normally used for drinking water, but which seemed like the right application here, and she covered it with the better of her 2 bandanas and changed it after 24 hours. The wound closed faster than she expected. On the second morning, the edges were knitting in a way that she would have flagged as concerning in a human patient, but which she decided to interpret, in the absence of any other information, as a good sign. He moved quietly. That mattered enormously in their situation, and it turned out to be natural to him rather than learned. He moved through underbrush with a kind of bodily awareness that reminded her of deer, each placement of foot or limb deliberate, no unnecessary sound. When she held still, he held still. When she moved, he followed the same path she had taken, stepping where she stepped, which she appreciated more than she could have easily articulated. She learned his name, or the first part of it, by pointing at herself and saying "Carla," until he made a sound back, low and considering, and then she pointed at him and waited, and he said something her throat could not have reproduced if she had practiced for a year. Her brain received it, classified it, and filed it under the closest available approximation. She called him Ren. He seemed to accept this. His 4 eyes cycled, a movement she noticed from the beginning, a rapid sequential blink from the topmost eye to the bottommost that she associated with him thinking hard about something. And then he said, "Carla," quite precisely, with the vowels slightly different and the second syllable a beat longer than she used herself, and she felt something in her chest do something uncomplicated and good. By the third day, she had learned that he understood hand signals. She didn't know if this was a language his people used in some form, or if he was simply observant enough and intelligent enough to map gesture to meaning across the gap in real time. But when she made a flat palm stay gesture, he stayed. When she made a two-finger sweep, he looked where she was pointing. When she held up a closed fist, he froze instantly, without hesitation, the way a well-trained search and rescue partner would. She didn't know who was looking for him. She assumed someone was. She had seen the ships in the upper atmosphere. Her binoculars were excellent, and she had climbed high enough on day 2 to get a clear view before the cloud cover changed. And there were many, many ships, organized in a way that was not random, that spoke of coordinated purpose. They were not human ships. She had seen enough footage of Verk vessels in the emergency broadcasts to recognize the silhouette. She assumed whoever was looking for him would not be friendly to her, or to her cooperation with him, or to both. She began making contingency plans. The Veth-class hunters found the crash site on the morning of day 12. Carla heard them from 400 meters away because she had spent 8 years learning every sound this forest made, and these sounds were wrong. Not loud, wrong. There was no snapping of branches, no crunch of footfall, none of the noisy displacement that most large animals made moving through dense undergrowth. The Veth moved in near silence, their 6-legged gait adapted for complex terrain, their weight distributed in a way that minimized ground impact. But they displaced air at a frequency below the threshold of conscious hearing, a kind of presence that felt like barometric pressure change, and the birds in the upper canopy reacted to it, going silent in a wave species by species, the insect eaters first and then the larger corvids, the silence spreading outward from the hunter's position like rings on water. She knew birds. She had been cataloging bird behavior in this sector for 3 years as a secondary function of her posting. She knew exactly what avian silence sounded like and what caused it. She woke Wren with a hand on his shoulder. She had learned on day 3 that waking him with a sound, even a quiet one, produced a flinch response followed by a reach for something that wasn't there. A reflexive gesture that suggested he was used to having a weapon and currently didn't have one. So she always used touch, and held up 2 fingers, pointed in the direction of the wrongness, and then held up the flat palm stay. He understood. His 4 eyes cycled once quickly, and he flattened himself against the far wall of their current shelter, a shallow cave with a screen of brush across the entrance that she had positioned during the night, arranging each piece by hand so that the natural gap patterns in the cover matched the surrounding vegetation, and he did not make a sound. She took her pack, her boots, and her knowledge of the terrain, and she went to work. The first thing she did was cross the stream twice, upstream, then back down 100 meters to the east, then upstream again. She had read enough about tracking to know that crossing water broke scent trails and confused many kinds of sensors, and while she didn't know exactly what the Veth hunters were using, she knew water was a variable they would have to account for, and that accounting for it would cost them time. The second thing she did was find the old deadfall she had marked on her mental map 6 weeks ago, a large-scale branch collapse that had created a zone of disturbed debris spanning roughly 30 meters. And she moved through it deliberately, leaving clear evidence of passage, pressing down the bark with her weight, breaking smaller branches at standing height. She was not trying to lay a false trail toward herself. She was trying to establish that something large had moved through the area, creating a data point that would take time to evaluate. The third thing she did was climb. She was not trying to escape. She was trying to learn what she was dealing with. From the ridge, watching through binoculars with her elbows braced on stone and her breathing controlled, she counted 8 of them. They were tall nearly 3 meters, and moved on 4 of their 6 limbs in dense cover, using the upper 2 pairs of limbs for balance and the lowest pair as primary locomotion. Their coloring was adaptive. She watched one of them stand still against a tree trunk and nearly disappear over the course of 90 seconds, the skin tone shifting incrementally toward gray-brown. Their heads were elongated, with sensory apparatus she identified as active along the jaw ridges, something that oriented towards sound or vibration, she thought, based on the way the ridges stood erect whenever they were moving slowly and investigating. They were organized. She had seen wildlife management teams work together, had seen search and rescue operations, had seen the coordination of people who had trained together for a long time. The Veth moved with a precision that exceeded any of those, not the stiffness of people following rules, but the fluidity of people for whom the coordination had become physical instinct. The pattern they were using was not a line sweep. A line sweep she could have walked through the gaps of, given the terrain. What she observed instead was something that behaved like a compression pattern, units moving independently but referencing each other's positions, the overall effect being a slow tightening of the search area, any gap that opened on one side being compensated for by movement on another. Like a net drawing closed, except that the net could think. She watched them for 11 minutes. She counted sight lines. She identified 3 positions within the current terrain that the pattern would reach within 2 hours. She identified one that it would not reach for at least 6 hours. Then she went back down the other side of the ridge. "They're tracking the beacon," she told Wren when she returned. He looked at her. She held up her wrist, pointing at it. She had established early on that wrist gestures indicated time or tracking in her improvised vocabulary. And then she made a fist and a signal she had invented to mean gone or stop. She had used it before in the context of their fire on the 3rd night, when she had smelled weather coming and wanted the smoke trail to end. Stop, put it out. He understood this time differently. His 4 eyes went through the rapid cycling movement that she associated with him, processing something important, something that had personal weight to it, and then he reached up and touched the side of his neck, below his ear, where she had noted on day 1 a faint raised line she had assumed was either scarring from the crash or a natural anatomical feature. He pressed it. She heard nothing, but she thought she felt something, a pressure change that lasted half a second, a shift in the quality of the air in the cave, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the charge of the atmosphere changes without any visible cause. He lowered his hand and looked at her. "Beacon," she said, touching her own neck in the place that corresponded. He made the sound she had filed under yes, a soft forward click made with the front of his mouth that he had established on day 2 as his affirmative. "Did you just turn it off?" The click again. She sat back on her heels and thought about this. They would still have his biological signature, she thought. She didn't know enough about alien tracking technology to assume otherwise, and she was not going to make the mistake of believing she had just solved the problem simply because she had reduced it. But removing the active beacon signal was not nothing. It would cause the hunters to reassess. It might change the search pattern. It might create gaps. It might also tell them they were getting close enough to panic the target. She had to account for that possibility. "Okay," she said, "we're moving tonight." He made the forward click. She moved him 7 kilometers over the next 2 nights. The terrain worked in her favor in ways that required 8 years of accumulated knowledge to exploit. She knew which streams ran underground for stretches in this region, disappearing below the rock shelf and resurfacing 200 meters downstream. She walked him along one of these for nearly 2 kilometers, their feet cold and wet, moving in the dark with only starlight and her memory of the path to guide her. Wren did not complain. He stumbled twice on submerged rocks and caught himself both times without making a sound. She adjusted her pace for the 3rd kilometer and he matched it. She knew where the thermal vents in the eastern foothills created dead zones for airborne sensors. She had complained about them extensively in her quarterly equipment reports, because drones sent near them for wildlife census work came back with corrupted data files, and the survey teams kept blaming the equipment when it was clearly the terrain. She moved them through 2 of these zones before dawn on the 2nd night. She could not know exactly what the Veth's aerial support was calibrated for, but she knew that thermal dead zones were dead zones for a reason, and reason was the best she could work with. She knew where the old mining infrastructure ran through the rock below the tree line, tunnels. Some collapsed, some still passable, dug before she was born and abandoned decades before she applied for her posting. Their entrances marked on no current map, but on the survey records she had studied obsessively in her first year on the job, because knowing what was under the ground was as important as knowing what was on it. She moved them into one on the third day, and they slept in the dark on packed earth while she sat near the entrance and listened. She thought, in the silence of the tunnel with Ren sleeping behind her, sleeping with the depth of the genuinely exhausted, not the fitful half-wakefulness of someone afraid, about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she needed to learn. She knew the terrain better than the hunters. That was her primary advantage, and she had to treat it as finite. They were learning the terrain too, every hour they spent in it. She knew how to move without being heard or seen in conditions she had trained in for years. That was worth something, but the Veth's adaptive coloring and near-silent movement made them difficult to avoid through skill alone. She knew how to read the forest's reactions to the hunter's presence. That was the most valuable thing she had, and it was entirely dependent on her attention never flagging. She didn't know what the hunter's sensors could do. She didn't know the ceiling or floor of their tracking capability. She didn't know whether Ren's biological signature was as detectable to them as the beacon had been, or less so, or more so. She began to treat every unknown as a potential threat. The hunters adapted. That was what began to frighten her on day 4 of the hunt. Not the size of them or the weapons they carried or the numbers, the adaptation. The compression sweep she had observed on day 1 disappeared on day 2. By day 3 they were moving in smaller independent units, pairs rather than the full 8 ranging farther from each other but maintaining some kind of communication she couldn't detect. On day 4 she found something she hadn't expected, marks on trees, not random. A systematic notation cut into bark at a specific height in a consistent pattern that she identified as grid marking. They were building a reference system. They were not just searching, they were mapping. That changed her assessment significantly. A search team that mapped as it searched was not going to exhaust and withdraw. A search team that mapped was constructing a framework that would get more efficient with every passing day. Each marked tree reducing uncertainty. Each grid square cleared constraining the remaining possibilities. She had been operating on the assumption that she could outlast them by making the problem too difficult to solve. That assumption needed revising. She began to make harder choices. The first hard choice was to move in daylight. Everything about her training said not to. Movement meant noise and visibility and risk of direct contact. At night, her human eyes were less effective than theirs appeared to be, given how confidently they moved in darkness. The logical choice was to rest during the day and move at night. She reversed it. Her reasoning, the aerial element they had added on day 3, moved through the upper canopy faster at night, presumably using thermal signatures that were cleaner against a cold night forest than a warm afternoon one. During the day she could see the canopy above her, could watch for the disruption in bird behavior that meant something was overhead, could use shadow and dappled light in ways she understood better than any scanner. She moved Ren in daylight, under the thickest cover, at a pace that made her lungs ache, stopping every 30 minutes for 5 minutes of absolute stillness and listening. The second hard choice was to stop trying to hide where she had been and start trying to control what they were looking for. There was a section of the eastern slope she had named in her head years ago, the Echo Maze, a series of narrow stone corridors where the rock fractured in a way that made sound behave unexpectedly, bouncing off surfaces in patterns that made localization nearly impossible. She had lost track of her own radio signals in there twice. She had once spent 20 minutes thinking an injured deer was east of her position when it had been south and below her the entire time. She led them through the echo maze twice in one day, forward and back, taking different paths through it both times, then exiting in different directions, and then doubling toward each other to confuse the trail. This cost 4 hours and significant energy. She judged it worth the cost when she observed, from a high point later that afternoon, the hunters' pattern dissolving into something that looked less like a net drawing closed and more like a group of people arguing about where to go next. Uncertain was what she needed. She filed the echo maze away as a resource to return to. On the 7th day of the hunt, one of them found them. She was moving Wren along a creek bed in the early afternoon, the water shallow enough to walk through, the sound of it covering their movement, the cold of it keeping their thermal signature reduced. She had been using this creek for the past 90 minutes, and she was planning to exit it at the shelf of rock another quarter-kilometer ahead, where the creek dropped, and the bedrock formed a natural ramp she could use to exit without leaving traceable Banks impressions in mud. She heard the pressure change. It was different from the ambient pressure she had learned to track, not the distant spread of it that meant hunters in the area, but localized, close, specific. Like the difference between knowing a storm is somewhere on the horizon and feeling the first drop hit your face. She turned. The hunter was on a boulder at the creek's edge, 8 meters away, and it was looking directly at her. Everything about its posture communicated that it had been there for a moment before she turned, that it had found her and chosen not to act before she became aware of it, which meant it was capable of choice in that moment, which meant it was not operating on pure instinct or automated protocol. It had sensory ridges fully erect, its 4 lower limbs planted on the boulder, the upper 2 holding something she didn't need to be an expert in alien weapons designed to identify as a weapon. It was pointed at her chest. She had never been in combat. She had spent her career in situations that periodically became dangerous. A hunter once pointing a rifle at her when she had sighted him, a group of hikers in a situation that had escalated faster than it should have, 3 encounters with large predatory animals at close range. And in all of those situations she had learned the same thing, which was that the first second was the one that determined almost everything that followed, and that in the first second, the most important thing she could do was not react. She did not reach for anything. She did not push Wren away from her or pull him behind her. She did not run or crouch or shout. She stood in the creek with her hands visible at her sides, and she looked at the hunter the way she had learned to look at things that could hurt her, not as prey, not as a threat, but as something she was trying to understand, not in the sense of calm philosophical inquiry, in the sense of, I have 1 second to correctly assess what you will do next, and if I am wrong I die, so I am going to use this second correctly. The hunter did not fire. That was the first piece of information. In the circumstances, she would have expected a hunter trained to locate and retrieve a target, not to protect a target's captor, not to negotiate, to act immediately upon location. It had not acted. That meant something. She didn't have enough context to know exactly what it meant, but something. She thought, and this was a calculation performed in the time it takes to breathe in, that there were 2 most likely explanations. 1. It was waiting for backup, either because its protocols required it or because it had assessed her as a threat that required more than 1 unit. 2. It was uncertain about the situation it had found, specifically about her relationship to the target it had been sent to retrieve, and it was waiting because action taken in uncertainty was bad protocol. She went with 2 because it required something she could do something about. She kept her hands visible and she turned her body very slightly, by about 10 degrees, so that her shoulder was toward Wren, so that anyone analyzing the configuration of the 2 of them would register the relationship between them without her having to create a sudden movement to demonstrate it. She let the angle of her body say, I am connected to this child. She pointed at Wren. She pointed at herself. She put her hand over her own heart. She knew this was a human gesture and entirely possibly meaningless. She did it anyway because it was the most honest communication she had available. The hunter stood very still on its boulder. She stood very still in the creek. Wren stood quietly beside her and did not make a sound. Later she would think about that, about a 14-year-old who had been through a crash and 11 days in an alien wilderness, and who, at the moment a member of an elite hunting unit had its weapon pointed at his protector, had stayed still, had understood without being told that stillness was what the moment required. She would think about that for a long time. After a period she could not accurately time, the hunter made a sound. Complex, tonal, layered, not a weapon discharge, a communication. She didn't know what it said. She knew it was a communication because she was still alive. They were escorted, not captured. This distinction mattered. She was aware that from any external perspective it would look the same. She was being moved in a direction she had not chosen by beings that could have killed her. But the internal experience of it was different, and the behavioral signals she was receiving were different, and she cataloged those differences carefully because they were the only information she had. The weapon was not directly trained on her after the first moment of contact. When Wren stumbled on a submerged root and went down to one knee, one of the hunters, a different one from the first, larger, with a different pattern to its sensory ridge arrangement, caught him. Caught him with what amounted to a reflexive gesture, a reaching out that spoke of training and also of something underneath training that didn't have a name in tactical vocabulary. Set him upright carefully. Checked his injured arm with what looked, at the resolution she could observe, like concern. She watched this and filed it under. They are here to recover someone they care about. That was different from what she had prepared herself for. The clearing where the shuttle waited was at the top of a meadow she knew. She had counted wildflowers in it in June. She had repaired a trailhead sign at its southern edge on a bright Tuesday in August that she remembered, because a pair of young hikers had stopped to chat while she worked. A brother and sister arguing cheerfully about something she couldn't remember now, and she had enjoyed the sound of their argument, and then enjoyed the silence after they left. She had sat in this meadow and eaten lunch, and watched the Alpine Swifts wheel overhead. Seeing the alien shuttle sitting at its center was one of the stranger experiences of her life, and the bar for strangeness had been significantly raised over the past 11 days. They were taken up. She had never been in a spacecraft. It was smaller than her imagination had made them, functional rather than grand, like the inside of a well-designed piece of equipment rather than an architectural statement. The resonance was what surprised her. Not loud the way a jet was loud, but a subsonic vibration she felt in her teeth and in the bones of her forearms, a reminder that she was inside something operating at scales that did not account for human comfort tolerances. She sat where she was put and kept her hands visible, and she watched Wren. He was no longer maintaining the careful stillness she had come to associate with their time in the forest. His posture was changing. The held-in quality of someone managing circumstances too large for them was releasing, incrementally, like a fist, unclenching slowly. Two of the hunters spoke to him, and he spoke back at length, and she understood none of the content, but she understood the register. Relief, explanation, something that might have been the particular relief of being understood in your own language for the first time after a very long time without it. His 4 amber eyes were cycling rapidly, the way she had come to associate with strong emotion that he was managing rather than suppressing. She was glad for him. She was genuinely glad, a clean and simple gladness that didn't have anything complicated mixed into it. She was also very aware that she might be about to die, and that she had done what she could, and that she would rather die having done what she could than survive having done nothing. She had decided this somewhere around day 4, sitting in the dark of the mining tunnel with her back against cold stone, and the decision had made the subsequent days easier. Not easier to survive, easier to live through. The distinction was not small. The shuttle docked. Velkarith was waiting. The corridor that the door opened into was larger than corridors had any right to be. She stepped out into it, and her mind performed the automatic adjustment that minds made when confronted with dimensions they hadn't planned for. And then it performed the adjustment again for the light, which came from the walls themselves in a warm amber that had no point source she could identify, and that was exactly the color of Ren's eyes. There were 6 figures in the corridor arranged in a formal configuration, paired flanking, one in front, one slightly set back from the central position. She identified the formation as ceremonial as well as practical. This was not a corridor you arrived in unprepared. Someone had chosen this corridor, this lighting, this arrangement. The one at the center was the stillest. He was larger than the hunters who had brought them here. Not just taller, denser, somehow, more present, with a quality that she associated not with physical size but with the particular gravity of people who had spent a long time making decisions that other people had to live with. His jaw plates were darker and more complex in their layering than the hunters. His 4 eyes, the same amber as Ren's, she noticed, the same amber as the light in the walls, were looking at his son. Ren crossed the corridor. He stopped in front of his father and made a sound she had not heard him make before. Small, cracked at the edges, young in a way that 11 days in the forest had not been able to make him young, because in the forest youth was a risk and he had kept it contained. Velkarith moved. She had prepared herself, watching for formality, for the constrained reunion of important people who had the weight of watching eyes on them. She had seen footage of public reunions between powerful figures, and she knew what they looked like: measured, careful, demonstrative only in prescribed ways. He folded himself nearly in half and pressed his face against the top of his son's head and made a sound she understood without translation, without any translator or any shared language, without anything except the recognition of a parent who had spent 11 days not knowing. She looked away. When she looked back, the quality of the corridor's atmosphere had changed in a way she recognized as the particular shift that followed an intimate moment becoming a public one again, the recalibration of a space from private to shared. Velkarith had straightened. His son was at his side, and the first prelate of the Verk ascendancy was looking at her. She held his gaze, 4 eyes to 4 eyes. He said something. The translator located, she thought, somewhere in the corridor itself rather than on any individual person, based on the directionality of the rendered voice, provided the words, "He is alive." "Yes," she said. "You kept him alive." She considered this for a moment. "We kept each other alive," she said. "He's very good at staying quiet." Something moved in the layered jawplates, she thought, later, that it was probably the Verk equivalent of a compressed smile, the kind of expression that acknowledged something true that the face doesn't know quite how to contain. He said something she did not receive from the translator, something directed inward, toward the officers flanking him, and they reacted with the small controlled movements of people who were surprised and managing it. Then Velkarith bent. Not an incline of the head, not the small controlled acknowledgement of an important person making a diplomatic gesture. He bent deeply, at the midsection where the Verk body had its primary joints, in a movement that was biologically equivalent to a human going down on one knee, and he held the position. The 6 officers behind him bent at the same moment, and to the same degree with the precision of people for whom formal protocol was physical memory, except that this particular protocol, she would learn later, did not have a formal name in the Verk ceremonial vocabulary, because it had not been performed in 400 years, and the last time it had been performed to mark the end of a war. She stood in her park ranger shirt, 11 days dirty, with creek water still in her boots from the morning. She looked at the ceiling for 2 seconds. She blinked once. "I was just doing my job," she said. The translator rendered this. Velkarith straightened and looked at her. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Your people have no word for what you did. We might, she said. We have a lot of words. He looked at her with the four-stacked amber gaze that she had spent 11 days learning to read, and that she found, in this moment, entirely legible. You were alone in hostile terrain, without weapons, without support, against hunters of the highest training class, for 11 days, protecting a child who was not your own and who was not of your kind. You did not hide. You outmaneuvered. She thought about the echo maze, the thermal vents, the stream paths and the underground tunnels and the deadfall and the counterintuitive decision to move in daylight, the moment in the creek when she stood still instead of running. This is my forest, she said. I've been learning it for 8 years. The first prelate considered this. Then, my hunters are trained for 100 years. They did well, she said honestly. They adapted faster than I expected. I was running out of tricks. He was quiet again. The 4 eyes moved in that cycling pattern, rapid, sequential, and she realized, watching it, that he did the same thing Ren did, the same rapid processing gesture, and that she had not recognized it as a family trait until this moment because she had only ever seen it in Ren. She filed this observation away, without entirely knowing why. Then he said, "What do you want, you may ask?" She opened her mouth on the automatic response. "Nothing, I want nothing. I was just doing what was right," and then stopped. Because she was 37 years old and she had spent 13 days on a mountain thinking in the quiet way that people only thought when noise was dangerous, and she had thought, in the dark tunnels and under the cold stars and in the creek water running over her boots, about a great many things, about why this had happened, about what came after, about the people she knew who were sitting in evacuation centers somewhere on flat ground with fluorescent lights, waiting. "The forest," she said. "Leave it. Leave all of it, the northern wilderness, the southern protected zones, the river corridors. No landings, no scans, no resource surveys, no patrol routes through it. Let the people still in the evacuation centers come home." She paused. "And leave the rest of the planet alone long enough for us to figure out whether there's any arrangement possible that doesn't involve anyone running from anyone." The corridor was very quiet. "That is a significant request," the translator said. "Yes," she said, "you asked what I wanted." Something that was not quite a pause and not quite a conversation happened between the first prelate and the officers behind him. A series of small directed sounds and posture shifts that she couldn't read but that clearly had content, and she waited, because she was good at waiting, and because there was nothing else to do. Ren was watching her from his father's side. His 4 amber eyes were cycling in that way she associated with strong feeling being carefully held. He made the sound she had filed a long time ago under "thank you," the one that resonated in the spaces behind her sternum. She made the hand gesture she had made the first night in the entrance of the boulder. "Come in, sit down, you're welcome here." The same gesture that had worked then, offered back now. He made the forward click. She looked at the first prelate. "My son's life is worth what you have named," he said, "and more." They sent her back 3 days later. The 3 days were not uncomfortable, exactly. They were strange, in the particular way that things were strange when they were entirely outside any category your experience had prepared you for. She was given a space to stay in, small, lit in amber, with something that functioned as a sleeping surface and something that functioned as water access, though the mechanism for the water took her an hour to figure out. Meals appeared at intervals that she thought were approximately correct, the food alien but, with one significant exception involving a texture she declined to repeat, edible. She slept a great deal. Ren visited twice. He was different here than he had been in the forest, not less himself, but more of himself, the parts of him that 11 days in hostile terrain had required him to suppress present again. He talked more, though she understood little of it. He showed her things on what she thought was a personal communication device, images and sounds, with the particular enthusiasm of someone sharing something they cared about with someone they hoped would understand. She understood about 40% of it. He seemed to count this as success. On the second visit, he brought her something small, round, opaque, the color of dried moss, and set it in her palm and closed her fingers over it and made a sound she had not heard before, complex and tonal and not translatable by the corridor system, which was absent here. She held it for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and gave him the last of her trail mix. The bag had 3 almonds and a fragment of dried cranberry in it. He received them with the same care he had received the half-can of beans on the first night. She was released, if released was the word, on the morning of the third day, with a medical kit that was more comprehensive than anything in the Park Service inventory. Her pack replenished with supplies she didn't entirely recognize, but that she was confident she could figure out, and a small device that the communications officer explained through the translator would serve as locator and identifier, recognized by any Verk vessel, indicating protected status. She didn't ask exactly what protected status meant in their taxonomy. She chose to believe it meant what it sounded like. The shuttle landed in the meadow where she counted wildflowers, and the door opened, and the forest was there, exactly as it had always been, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. She got out and stood at the edge of the meadow and breathed it in wet stone and pine resin, and the particular cold sun smell that this elevation had in late morning, and she let herself feel, for the length of one full breath, the entirety of what it meant to be standing there. The shuttle left. The birds came back first, filtering down from the upper canopy to the middle branches where they preferred to be, their calls reasserting the normal soundscape one voice at a time. Then the wind, which had been absent in the shuttle's displacement and now returned along the ridge. Then everything else, the full, accumulated 1,000-part sound of the mountain going back to what it knew. She shouldered her pack and started walking. She had a radio, she clicked it on. "Munoz," she said. "Park Service Northern Sector. I'm at Grid 72 Meadow Clearance. Any station, please respond." Static, and then a voice coming through the static in a rush, younger than she expected and rough with something that took her a moment to identify as relief. "Munoz. Carla Munoz. This is Harlan at Station 4. We thought it's been almost 2 weeks." 13 days, she said, counting today. A pause. "Are you okay? What happened?" She looked up through the canopy at a sky that was, for the moment, simply sky. Blue and cloudless and exactly as large as it had always been. "Long story," she said. "What's the status of the evacuation zones?" "Still locked down, but the ships in the upper atmosphere, they've been pulling back. This morning early. We don't know why." "I might know why," she said. "Munoz. I'm going to walk out the South Trail. It'll take most of the day. Leave a pot of coffee on." "A pot of yes. Yes, copy. There's a lot of people who'll want to." "One thing at a time," she said. "Coffee first, everything else after." She clicked the radio to stand by and started walking. The trailhead sign at the South Meadow had a broken bracket she had been meaning to fix for 6 months. She stopped and looked at it. The repair took 4 minutes and the tool was in her pack, and she fixed it, tightened the mount, checked the post for stability, stepped back to look at it level against the morning light coming through the trees at the angle she liked best, slanted and gold. She walked on. She had told the first prelate that she knew her forest. That was true, and she had meant it, and it had kept them alive. But there was another thing that was also true, a thing she had not mentioned because there was no diplomatic occasion for it, and because it was the kind of thing that didn't require saying out loud. She had known, from the moment Wren appeared in the entrance of the boulder, bleeding and frightened and young, that she was going to do everything she could. Not because she had assessed the situation and determined it was strategically viable. not because of some calculation about first contact and species survival, and the diplomatic value of protecting an alien leader's child, though all of those things were true and might eventually be important. Not because she was brave, in the sense of having no fear. She had been afraid for all 11 days, a constant low-grade fear that she had learned early in her career to treat as information rather than instruction. Because he was a child, and he was hurt, and he was scared, and he had sat where she pointed, and he had eaten the beans she offered him, and he had said thank you in whatever way his body knew how, and that had been the entirety of what she needed to know. She had spent 8 years learning this mountain, so she would know what to do when it mattered. It had mattered. She walked out into the morning under the canopy, with the creek noise somewhere to her left and the birds settling back into their routines overhead, and the forest said nothing, the way forests did, and she was home. High above her, in the upper atmosphere where the clouds thinned to nothing and the dark of space began, the sovereign silence adjusted its position. Slowly, the deliberate movement of something very large making a decision. It would take time. 14 worlds had a great deal to discuss, and the conversation that was beginning, the conversation that she had asked for, that she had named as her price, that Velkareth had agreed to, would not be simple or short. Diplomacy between species was never simple or short. It was made of 10,000 small choices and a great deal of waiting and the willingness to learn the language of something that had not been shaped by your same history. She knew something about that. But the first prelate had bent to something real in a corridor lit by amber light, in front of 6 officers who would carry the record of it across the fleet. He was not a man who bent and then pretended the bending had not happened. His son was alive. A human woman who knew a mountain had made it so. She had asked for what she wanted, and what she wanted was not revenge and not victory, and not the satisfaction of having proven something, but for the people who lived in the evacuation centers on flat ground under fluorescent lights to be allowed to come home. He was going to give them that. Not as politics, not as strategy, as a debt that he had named in front of witnesses in the oldest kind of accounting that any species recognized, the debt of a life returned. She came out of the tree cover at the trailhead, and there were 3 people waiting. Harlan, who was 24 and had been at Station 4 for 18 months, and who she had once convinced not to quit by simply sitting outside with him for an hour on a bad night, and 2 others she recognized from the sector office. All 3 of them were looking at her with the particular expression of people who had not been certain what they would find. "Coffee," she said. Harlan laughed. It sounded like the birds coming back after the silence. It sounded like the wind coming back after the shuttle left. It sounded like the mountain remembering what it was. She walked toward them. Behind her and above her and very far away, something very large moved in the direction of away, and the sky was the sky again, and the mountain was the mountain, and the long work of figuring out what came next was just beginning, and she was, she thought, going to need a great deal of coffee for it. That seemed manageable. She had managed worse. Later, weeks later, when the first formal communication came from the Verk Ascendancy through the newly established relay station at the outer belt, she was asked by the government liaison who had been assigned to manage all of this, a careful-looking man from an office in a city she had never worked in, what exactly she had said to the prelate. What words, specifically? What promise had she extracted, and how? What leverage she had used? She told him the truth, which was that she had no leverage. She had nothing. She had a half-empty pack and creek water in her boots and 8 years of learning a mountain, and what she had extracted had not been extracted at all, it had been offered. Because a father whose child was alive owed a debt, and the debt had been named, and the Verk, apparently, were people who named their debts and paid them. The liaison wrote all of this down and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up and asked if she would be willing to serve as a cultural liaison in the preliminary talks. She had, he said, a demonstrated ability to communicate across significant barriers. She thought about the half-can of beans, the hand signals, the mining tunnel in the dark. She thought about Velkareth pressing his face against the top of his son's head. She thought about the moss-colored thing Ren had pressed into her palm, which she had not given to the government liaison and was not going to, and which sat on her windowsill at the station residence where it caught the morning light and held it the way amber held light. "I'll need to stay based here," she said, "in the northern sector." The liaison looked at her as if this was an unexpected condition. "This is my forest," she said again. "I'm not leaving it." He agreed to her terms. She went back to work. The first alpine swift of the season had been sighted the previous afternoon near the eastern thermal ridge. She had nesting data going back 6 years, and the population trajectory was one she had been monitoring with concern. There was also the matter of the stream survey in the lower watershed that had been delayed by 3 weeks due to the evacuation, and the deadfall clearance on the South Trail that was becoming a safety issue, and the bracket on the trailhead sign that she had fixed, but that she wanted to check again after the frost. There was always work. There was the work of the mountain, which did not pause for alien fleets or diplomatic crises or moments in amber-lit corridors, where the history of a planet turned on a half-can of beans, and a woman who had decided, 11 days before, that doing what she could was the only answer to what was happening. She put on her pack and went out into the morning. The forest received her the way it always had, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without particular regard for whether she had just participated in something that would be written about for a very long time. It was a forest. It was doing what forests did. The birds were in the trees and the water was in the creek, and the light was coming through the canopy at the angle she had been watching for 8 years, and she knew every variation of it, and she could not imagine, genuinely could not imagine, being anywhere else. She walked north. Somewhere in the canopy above her a swift called, the sharp, high needle sound of them that she had been waiting to hear since February. She stopped and looked up and found it, fast and small against the morning sky, and she counted it in the tally she kept in the pocket notebook she had carried for 8 years, worn soft with use, its pages marked with the careful record of a mountain learning itself through the observer who loved it. One swift, eastern thermal ridge north face, first sighting of season. She wrote it down. Then she put the notebook back in her pocket and kept walking. The mountain was hers, she was the mountain's. Everything else, the ships in the upper atmosphere, the liaison in the city, the talks beginning in the relay station, the slow and complicated work of 2 civilizations trying to find the words for something that didn't have words yet, all of that was real, and she would do her part of it, and she would do it well because she did things well. But the mountain came first. It always had.